Good morning. I am going to be trying to cover about 1,500 years here in about 15 minutes, so hold on tight. We're going to move rather quickly. I'm excited about this service. It's kind of an interesting thing to think about, and I think Levon and Nevin will probably talk about it a little bit more. Why does it matter that we're Anabaptist? It's clearly not the most important thing, right? And yet, even though our Anabaptism is maybe not it's not what saves us, it is still a valuable part of how we live, and it's something important to think about, and something that we should value and hold in its rightful place. So, I'm going to be talking about what led up to the first rebaptism in 1525, 500 years ago on Tuesday, and the timeline that I created here, I ended at us in, 2025. I'm not actually going to get the whole way. I'm going to get up to about 1525. So we start at the year 30, which is most likely when Jesus was crucified. There are different ways of calculating exactly what year it was. The Bible says that Jesus was 30 years old when he began his ministry, right? Well, it says about 30. And it says that his ministry was 3 years, right? It says there were 3 Passovers. So it could have been closer to 2 years. In theory, there could have been more Passovers that weren't mentioned. That's probably not real likely. And Jesus was born in the year 1, right? Or 0, right? Okay. Well, there's not actually a year 0. And according to our dating methods, it seems like they miscalculated when they originally moved the calendar to be based on Jesus' birth. Jesus was probably born in about 5 BC. So Jesus was born 5 before Christ. Makes a lot of sense. But anyway, that's not our problem. It's people who created the calendar in the 700s maybe. So anyway, Jesus dies in the year 30 AD, and this sparks the beginning of the church, as we all know the story. Thought I knew this. There we go. All right. So, in the first couple hundred years after Jesus' death and resurrection, the church began and thrived as a sort of persecuted minority. And there were a couple things that happened in that time period. The church generally remained fairly pure, partly because there was so much persecution. It was not terribly, there wasn't a lot of reasons to fake it. And so for that reason, the church stayed pure in its practice and its teaching. There were plenty of problems. This was not a perfect church by any means. And over the first 250 years or so after Jesus' death and resurrection, the church encountered a lot of problems, and the church also moved from being this sort of looked down on fringe movement to being a group that was definitely still in the minority, but a little more well-known and a little bit more well-accepted. So sometimes they were persecuted, sometimes they weren't over the first 300 years. But broadly speaking, they became more well-accepted, even though they still faced a fair amount of persecution. And in the year, are you doing it?
I'm not sure if that seems to be working.
Okay, I'll give you the signal when I want the next one, okay? Anyway, in the year 312, Constantine was the emperor of the Roman Empire, where a lot of the church was centered. And he was well familiar with Christianity, and before a battle, he claims to have had a vision. And in this vision, he saw a cross, and he was told, in the name of the cross, go and conquer, essentially. And so I don't know, was he hallucinating? Did he misunderstand the vision? I don't think that God gives us visions that conflict with his word, and so I don't think God would give a vision telling somebody to go and fight a battle and, conquer and so on. But in any case, this was Constantine's claim, his testimony, and so he conquers in the name of the cross, wins the battle, and shortly thereafterwards, he first of all legalizes Christianity, and then after this, in the decades after this, Christianity goes from being legal to promoted to being not exactly forced, but more or less something along those lines. And so the church quickly went from being a persecuted minority to being, Christian is what you're expected to be, and there's great penalties if you're not. And so, as you can guess, the church quickly lost its purity, And in this context, it became much more of a nominal cultural type thing. The Roman Catholic Church, the foundation of what we look at as the Catholic Church today, was rapidly forming, bishops taking more and more power, with the bishop at Rome having supreme authority over the other bishops. And so by the 400s or so, about a century after Constantine, the Roman Catholic Church, as we think of it, had been formed by that point, roughly speaking. These things are all kind of general statements because obviously they're trends that take place over a period of time. All right, next. So in the year 476, the year 476, the Empire of Rome was conquered by invaders. It had already been weakened greatly by that point, and part of the empire, the Byzantine Empire in the east, remained, but Rome fell, and so the Roman Empire that had sort of held civilization, European civilization, together for about 1,000 years, suddenly no longer existed. And we enter the period that we know as the Middle Ages. So the Middle Ages kind of has a nice beginning because we mark it at the fall of Rome. You could mark the end of the Middle Ages at 1300 or 1500 or who knows where. Okay, it doesn't really have an exact ending. The Middle Ages we might think of kind of like this. Peasants out plowing fields. And we might think of it kind of like this. Castles. Okay. There were no central powers like Rome. There were a few groups like the Franks for a period of time that achieved a lot of power. The Byzantines were another one that at different points were fairly powerful, but nobody like Rome. And during this time period in the Middle Ages, learning greatly decreased, literacy decreased, fewer and fewer people read the Bible for themselves. The church sort of had this mentality that it's the job of the church leaders to teach us, and the church leaders tended to be very corrupt. And there were periods of time here where the vast majority of people had very little understanding of Scripture. Christianity and Catholicism became all the same thing. What am I doing wrong? Okay. Christianity and Catholicism essentially were the same thing. They didn't think of it as being the Catholic Church, in the way we would think of the Presbyterians and the Anabaptists, and they just thought Catholic was Christian. That's how they would have thought of it. And so the abuses of the church were significant, and the level of Christian experience level of Christian understanding was incredibly low during a lot of this period of time. We can probably assume that there were people who were sincere, who wanted to do the right thing, but with very low levels of literacy, very few people reading the Bible, the practice of the church became incredibly corrupted. During this time period, you can go to the next one, there were a few groups that tried to break off and tried to form something new, and typically they were severely persecuted, sometimes destroyed. So the Waldensians, that began sometime in the 1100s, they were one of the groups that survived a bit longer. But it's a little hard to tell what their group was really like because most of the writings about them came from the Catholic Church, who hated them and thought they were heretics. And so we had groups like the Waldensians, the Mogomili, Albigensians were a few others, and a lot of them were persecuted severely, sometimes basically pushed out of existence. It's hard to know exactly what they taught because mostly the Catholics wrote about what they taught and sort of probably mischaracterized to some degree the teachings of these groups. So there were movements during this time period to push back against the Catholic Church, but by and large, they were not very successful. Next one. In the 1300s, this movement that we call the Renaissance began, and the Renaissance was a movement where people tried to think more critically. There was more learning, more reading, literacy rates increased, and this movement centered around philosophy, around science, and it also began to influence the way people thought of religion. The Catholic Church still had a stranglehold on what was normal, but overall, people were beginning to challenge the Catholic Church a bit more. One of the people who challenged the Catholic Church during this era was John Wycliffe. John Wycliffe was from England, and he was far enough away from the center of the Catholic Church in Rome that the Catholic hold on that area was not quite as strong, and the people around him liked him. And so for that reason, he was protected. He translated the Bible. It's often how we think of him. And he died a natural death. The curious story about him is that some 50 years after his death, some 50 years after John Wycliffe's death, the Roman Catholic Church decided that they really do need to straighten out this heretic, even though he was long gone. And so they went to his grave, dug up his mostly decayed body, and burned it, just to make a point, I guess. So that was John Wycliffe, one of the early men to push back against the Catholic Church. Another one was Jan Hus, and he was from the area of the modern-day Czech Republic. And Jan Hus was less fortunate than Wycliffe in the sense that he pushed back against the Catholic Church, challenged them, began a bit of a movement, the Hussites, and he unfortunately did not die a natural death. He was captured and executed by the Catholic Church in the early 1400s. So these movements were progressing, and people became more and more willing to resist the Catholic Church and push back against their teaching. More people were studying the Bible and realizing that there were weaknesses and significant problems in the Catholics' approach to theology and practice. And one of the things that sped up this process significantly was the invention of the printing press. And so the printing press technology was developed over a period of time. 1455 could be a year you could peg it as. It's around that time period. And this allowed ideas to be printed and distributed via pamphlets, books at a much higher rate, and it was probably comparable to our age of the internet, when suddenly everybody has access to way more information than ever before. And this caused definitely, or I should say contributed to a change in the society at the time. People began to hear more about these ideas of men like Wycliffe and Jan Hus and form their own opinions, discuss them, were more willing to read the Bible and think it through and form their own opinions about it, rather than just feeling essentially captive to what the Catholic Church told them. Fast forward to the year 1517, and in Germany, in the town of Wittenberg, there's this monk, Martin Luther, who he studied the Bible, and he became convinced that the Catholic Church was wrong in some areas. And he was not initially convinced that the Catholic Church is not the true church. So he came up with a list of 95 things that he thought the Catholic Church was doing wrong. And the interesting thing about the 95 Theses, which he traditionally, it said that he nailed it to the church door in Wittenberg. The thing that's interesting about his list is that he was not really challenging the fact that the Catholic Church was the right church. He wasn't, his list sounds pretty Catholic. So for example, he didn't say that purgatory doesn't exist. He said that the way we think of purgatory is wrong. And he didn't say that the Pope is an illegitimate office. He just said that the Pope should do some things differently. But this resistance got people's attention, and he quickly realized that he has a lot of support. And so this fine-looking guy here sort of began pushing more and more, and realizing that as he continues to throw out new ideas and challenge the church in more ways, he continues to be supported. 300 years before, he would have been quickly captured and executed, and you would have never heard of him. But there's enough resistance to the Catholic Church that they don't immediately throw him out. And so his movement begins in 1517, and it progresses for a number of years. In 1521, he's called to this Diet of Worms, which is basically where, no, I'm not going to make any jokes about it, okay? A diet is a meeting, Worms is the town, and he's at this assembly with Catholic leaders, and they label him as a heretic, excommunicate him, and he soon afterwards goes into hiding. He doesn't stay in hiding very long or in exile. He comes out of it and continues to lead his movement. And in other places, there are also similar ideas and leaders emerging, and the most significant one by far, this is Luther at the Diet of Worms. The most significant one by far is Ulrich Zwingli, who in 1522 kind of makes a break from the Catholic Church in his home city of Zurich, Switzerland, and he works with his city council to bring about changes in Switzerland, challenging the Catholic Church. On the left is a picture of what Ulrich Zwingli may have looked like, and on the right is a picture of modern day Zurich. Among the people that Zurich worked with and taught, there were two Anabaptists to be. They weren't that at this time. Two men, Conrad Grebel and Felix Mons, who studied with him and began to push him to, among other things, not always be submissive to the city council. That was one of the things that came up. They studied a number of issues, and the one that came up that became a bit of a problem for them was the issue of infant baptism. They said infants should not be baptized because they can't genuinely believe, and Zwingli knew that the council would not support the practice of ending infant baptism, and so he sided with the city council because they were the ones who sort of propped him up politically, allowed him to have the power that he did. And so Grebel and Felix Mons, after receiving a sort of ultimatum from the Zurich City Council saying you must baptize your infants, Grebel and Felix Mons and another influential man who had joined their group a little bit later, George Blaurock, met, and in 1525, January 21st, as best we think we know the date, they met in the home of Felix Mons' mother, and as they discussed what they are to do about it, the council is saying that you must baptize your infants. They had, to this point, refused, and George Blaurock stood up and basically said, I want to be rebaptized. I'm going to say here that my baptism as an adult, as an infant, was not valid, and I want to be rebaptized. And they, in turn, then baptized each other. There were probably a few other people at the meeting. It's not clear exactly how many. The three main leaders were Felix Mons, Conrad Grebel, and George Blaurock. And in that context, they rebaptized each other, realizing that they would face significant persecution for it. It was one thing to not baptize an infant. That was serious. It was even much more serious to rebaptize somebody as an adult who had been baptized as a child. That kind of took it to a whole nother level. And so this is the beginning of Anabaptism 500 years ago. And for sake of time, I will not elaborate further. Dan will take the next section.
Sorry, I'm on now. Good morning. Glad to be here. Thank you, Jacob, giving us a sort of a quick overview of a number of years, quite a few years, centuries, in fact. This morning, I'm going to sort of pick up a little bit where Jacob ended there with rebaptisms. Hopefully my PowerPoint will come soon. I can use this. All right. Anabaptism, rebaptism, came at a cost, and that's what I'd like to think a little bit about this morning. The cost of Anabaptism. So these men, and probably some women, certainly women soon, were rebaptized. What did that mean? Why was it a big deal? As Jacob kind of said, the issue at first was what to do about infants. Conrad Grebel had an infant daughter. She hadn't been baptized. Why did you need to be baptized? Well, it was because the understanding, whether it was the Roman Catholic Church or the Protestant movements coming with Zwingli and Luther and others, was that baptism was a sign of your sins being washed away, and it was also sort of a sign of joining God's covenant people. And so they believed it's important to do that to children. All right? Now, some of the reformers started debating a little on whether or not children are really held accountable for sins. That was kind of the Catholic understanding. So the baptism washed their original sin away. So if they died, they could go to heaven eventually. Luther didn't necessarily think of it quite that way, and Zwingli didn't either. But not to get into it really deeply, but the idea also was tied to the fact that when you were baptized, you were part of the church, but you were also part of the community. And it was a religious ceremony, okay? It also served a little bit like getting your Social Security number today, all right? It was used for taxation purposes, to know how many people lived in a certain family and so forth. So infant baptism did all those things. From the Middle Ages, actually way back even in the late imperial time, to be rebaptized was against the law because it kind of suggested, or maybe stated better, that the original baptism that you had received from the official church was somehow invalid. It was wrong. And the church and the state working together said, that's not allowed. We all have to be part of the church. And there's only one church to be part of. All right? And that notion of having sort of one official church, was found in both the Catholic and Protestant perspectives in the 1500s. The Anabaptists, by doing what they did, were challenging that assumption that this was, my infant baptism was a legitimate baptism into the church. And you're saying, no, this is my own decision to follow Jesus. All right? I'm making this choice myself. And that came at a cost. And Jacob mentioned a little bit, it was against the law, and persecution came almost directly. There were a number of penalties that the government in Zurich imposed. If you did not baptize your infants, you could face fines. But the Zurich City Council, meeting in their council hall, determined that people who were rebaptized would be imprisoned and they would have their property confiscated. That was the sort of the initial punishment. Later in the year 1525, they pushed that, made a little harsher and said, be life imprisonment. Life imprisonment on bread and water. And that seemed to be continued, from their perspective, to be ineffective. And so in May of 1526, about a little less than a year and a half after the initial rebaptisms, the council decreed that any citizen in the canton of Zurich who was rebaptized would be executed by drowning. So the council said, this is serious. This is serious business. You cannot do this. You can't be rebaptized. If you are, you're going to pay a penalty, and it could cost you your life. So that's the context in which people are having to make a decision. Do I want to follow what I understand the Bible to teach? Do I want to follow Jesus when he says repent and be baptized? Or do I if I do that, I may lose my life? In spite of those penalties, Anabaptism did spread. Here's a map of Switzerland from the time. Zurich is there, one of the leading cantons or divisions in Switzerland, kind of self-governing collection of almost like little statelets kind of working together. That's what Switzerland is. So Zurich is there. It did not take long before people like Conrad Grebel, Felix Mons, George Blaurock, others moved out from Zurich. They're preaching the message, and they find a willing reception. Many people in the villages are baptized. They moved to Schaffhausen. It's a canton to the north. Conrad Grebel had some connections there. I believe one of his sisters lived there, went there. They also move a little bit to the east to St. Gallen, and also the neighboring canton then of Appenzell. They move a little bit to the west, southwest. That's Bern, one of the largest cantons, and they also out to the borderland there with Basel. I think some other ones as well. Eventually they move into Schwitz, which is the canton that gives the whole area its name. So it's spreading, and in many places the message appeals most to the middle and lower classes of people. Right? People who in some ways are discontent with the status quo. Right? The time of the Reformation is a time of revolution, changes in the air, and people are trying to decide how to live. There's a lot of people, and they hear Luther, and they hear Zwingli, and they hear other people, and they hear people from the Catholic Church, and they hear leadership, and it's an unsettled time. It really is. And the governing powers are kind of unsettled by all of this change as well. And so in some ways, as Anabaptism spreads, it goes even beyond Switzerland itself, which in its larger map from the time is here. The colored areas on here more or less represent what today we would call Germany and Austria and some other areas. It's the area that was called, in those days, sometimes historians call it the Holy Roman Empire. But it was the areas where most of the people spoke a German language. It wasn't a unified country by any means, but it was where people spoke German. And Switzerland was part of that at the very sort of southern end. If you go a little further over the Alps, you're in Italy, where people speak a different language. You move over here, they speak French. But most of these areas, people are speaking a dialect of German. So it's a similar culture and a similar language. Some of the other places that we find Anabaptism within probably the first year to year and a half of those first rebaptisms, there's a lot of activity in a town just over the Alps called Waldshut, which is ruled by the Archduke of Austria, but it's not in Austria. The priest there becomes an Anabaptist, and hundreds of people are rebaptized. We also find them in the Inn Valley, Innsbruck, and the Tyrol Valley. Those are areas that today are part of Austria. They were ruled by the Austrian Archduke. The city of Augsburg, early on, it's an imperial free city, as well as Strasbourg. They were kind of self-governing. Their leaders had adopted the Protestant views. There was some level of toleration for dissenting views, and so we find Anabaptists in those places as well. Even further north in Würzburg. The point I'm trying to make is that we find Anabaptists, the message spreading widely, and congregations emerging, and evangelists rebaptizing people in a lot of places, and it really does spread quickly. And the authorities are not happy. They're very unsettled by this whole thing. And so there is a lot of persecution, and we might say, well, what's the big deal? People are getting rebaptized. Is it really that significant? In our understanding of it, we would say, come on. You can be a loyal citizen and a good, upright person and not go to this church. You can go to that church, right? But that's not the way the authorities saw it, okay? They did not see it that way. They saw it as a threat to social order, okay? They saw it as a threat to social order. And from a religious perspective, they saw it in many cases as heresy. All right, so under Catholic governments, heresy was a capital offense, and it had been for a long, long time throughout the Middle Ages. What's heresy? Well, it's just sort of believing the wrong thing, splitting from the real church. All right, so heresy is a capital crime. And another aspect that led to persecution was the refusal of Anabaptists to acknowledge the authority of the state. Right? The Anabaptists essentially said that the Christian follows Jesus Christ. Jesus is our Lord. Right? We follow Jesus. We follow the state to the extent that it doesn't conflict with Jesus' teachings, but we follow Jesus first. And the authority of the state to determine what the church should do, what should be believed, how it should be practiced, the Anabaptists said, you can't do that. It's not what you're supposed to do. Jesus tells us. The scriptures show us Jesus' will. The state does not. And so that became a huge problem. Christians in a lot of areas were seen, Anabaptists were seen as bad citizens. They were like the bad citizens of a Christian nation, right? They refused to baptize their infants. That was a religious offense. Like I said, it was also kind of a social offense. So as if people said, we're not going to get Social Security for our children here. We're just not going to do that. Well, actually, in this country, you might get away with it. I don't know what would happen. Maybe you'd get a fine. And in this era, it was seen that you don't want to be a citizen here. Right? They would not swear oaths of loyalty to governments. They would not bear arms to defend their community against outside invasions or whatever. They would not participate in governing. They were bad citizens. All right? They weren't doing what they were supposed to do. All right? And of course, they judged the state and the state churches as ungodly, which is probably not going to make them very popular. They saw the state churches as corrupt and false. They did see the governing authorities as unchristian for persecuting them. Is that if you really were a Christian, you wouldn't persecute the people who want to follow Jesus. Kind of as a backdrop to all of this, though, I said the government authorities were running scared. In 1524 and 1525, there's a series of outbreaks of peasants' revolts or peasants' wars across a wide variety of areas, including Switzerland, where peasants, inspired somewhat by Reformed teachings said it's time to change the way society works. It's time to give us more rights. It's time for us to have more, to reduce the power of the nobility, to make our own decisions about matters in our own lives. And these revolts, while they were ultimately never successful, the peasants always got crushed, did involve real kind of warfare and sieges. And the governments of southern Germany and Switzerland and Austria were running scared about what could happen if the peasants really kind of got things together. And so this was kind of a backdrop. And to me, it kind of explains maybe a little why the governments may have taken a pretty hard line, because they did not want this to happen. We're familiar with any number of martyrs, and I'm not really going to talk a lot about some of these people, but probably the first known Anabaptist martyr that we have a record of was Hippolyte or Bolt Eberle, who was executed in Lachen in the canton of Schwyz in May 29, 1525. He was burned at the stake. That was a Catholic government, so they did that to heretics. And that's approximately 5 months after the initial rebaptisms. He was not from Zurich himself, but he traveled there, was rebaptized, and then traveled home. So he began to spread the word about his rebaptism and his vision for the church. The authorities caught him and burned him at the stake. But that's, of course, just a picture from the Martyr's Mirror of a person being burned, not particularly him. Felix Manz is well known that he was one of the initial Anabaptists. He was sentenced to death by drowning in 1527. On January 5th, they carried it out. This is a picture that shows an execution by drowning. Felix Manz was not tied up and pulled off of a little platform. He was tied up and dumped out of a boat in the Limmat River in the middle of Zurich. It's a public execution. And Conrad Grebel by this time was dead. He had died of the plague. His health was not good because of all the imprisonment he had endured for the past roughly year and a half. George Blaurock was driven out of the city, but because he wasn't a citizen, they did not execute him. He was beaten through the town, tied to a cart and beaten through the town on his bare back, and told if he ever returns, he'll be executed. He did not return. He went to other places. Eventually, in the Tyrol Valley in what today is Austria, he was caught, and in Klausen, he was burned at the stake in September 6th by the Austrian authorities. Michael Sattler is another person who was a former monk, came to Zurich, was introduced to the Anabaptists there. He was eventually rebaptized probably in 1526. In the spring of 1527, he and his wife and a number of other Anabaptists were captured. He was sentenced to be tortured and burned to death, which was carried out in Rottenburg in what today is the German state of Baden in May of 1527, a few months after Felix Manz. So these men paid for it with their lives. Michael Sattler's wife, Margareta, also was executed 2 days later. She was drowned. I don't know that some of these men were married, but the impact isn't just for men. There were lots of women that were eventually executed as well. And so we do have this backdrop in our history of people who were so committed to Jesus and the way of the Scriptures, they were willing to die. They were willing to give up their lives. Persecution has had an impact on the Anabaptists then, and it does to us today. And I want to sort of finish here soon. I don't want to interrupt too much of the other things, but some of the things that this did to Anabaptist life, first of all, it meant that their church life was very secretive. Some of you perhaps have been to Europe, and I have not. You've perhaps seen this Anabaptist cave. That's the kind of places they met, in the woods, in caves, in out-of-way places would meet for worship. They met frequently in small groups in homes to study the Bible if that was legal. In Catholic settings, it often was not. In Protestant settings, it often was. They held communion very irregularly when they could. They also put a priority on suffering. Anabaptists spoke much of following Jesus and taking up the cross. Jesus said, if you want to be my disciple, take up your cross daily and follow me. And they said, that's what we need to do. And taking up the cross means being willing to die. They saw persecution as a foretold consequence of identifying with Jesus. Jesus said, in this world you will have persecution, all right? But be of good cheer, I've overcome the world. And they saw it as a way of sanctifying themselves, and persecution reinforced their identity as God's people. They felt this is why we really actually are being persecuted. It's because we're following Jesus. Faced with this sort of ever-worsening penalties, some Anabaptists, some people suggested that maybe the ones who are true Christians, because after all, that's a sort of a spiritual thing, right? We're in a state of salvation and our spirits are saved. If we're true Christians, we could comply outwardly with the government's decrees and avoid trouble. This option kind of seems spiritual, and I'm sure it was attractive, and it did attract some people. It replaces the life of discipleship with more of an attitude of the heart or spirit, though. All right, and by and large, the Anabaptists, while some of them went that route, many of them said this doesn't seem quite what Jesus is talking about. In February of 1527, Michael Sattler led a group of people to meet in a town called Schleitheim in the canton of Schaffhausen, and they drew up this document at that meeting called the Brotherly Understanding, or the Brotherly Union. Sometimes we call it the Confession of Faith. This is the title page of it. All right, and this document is to try to unite people on what we believe that makes us distinct. And I'm not going to borrow too much from what Nevin and maybe Lavon have to say, but these are some things that are significant. And there's 7 areas that they sort of clarify their teaching on. Number 1 has to do with baptism. All right, baptism is people who request it. All right, so it's voluntary and it's a decision made by a believer, not by a baby. Secondly, the ban. That's the idea of church discipline against people who don't live in accordance with Jesus' commands if they fall into sin. The third thing has to do with communion. They promoted the same sort of view that Zwingli taught, which is that communion is a memorial service to remember Jesus' body and blood being shed and broken on the cross. Fourth, they talked here, Christians must be separate from the evils of the world. All right, do not run with them in the confusion of their abominations. Fourthly, they talk about shepherds or church leaders. They're to be chosen by congregations. In most settings, the government leaders chose the church leaders. Anabaptists are saying that's not how we do it. The congregations should choose their own shepherds. And sixthly, the sword. Christians are not permitted to use force and coercion against others because Jesus tells us to give up the sword. All right, it's an ordering of God outside the perfection of Christ. All right, there's a role for the government to use it. It's not appropriate for Jesus' disciples. And then in a similar way, the oath. Christians, by Jesus' commands in the Sermon on the Mount, are not to swear oaths. And so that's something that the law says is okay, but Jesus says his followers should not do. So those are the 7 articles, and this document it says served well as a statement of our beliefs and points on which we differ from both Catholic and Reformed Protestants, and all of them are things that I believe we would agree are still part of our Anabaptist beliefs today. All right, thank you very much for listening. I appreciate your attention. Hopefully you found it interesting. And I will, at this point, turn it over to the moderator.
Thank you, Dan and Jacob, for sharing. Now go over our announcements quickly, followed by our time of prayer. So, looks like this Wednesday at 7 o'clock is our annual, or I guess biannual, congregational meeting. Yes, are there any other announcements for this coming week or week or two? Yes.
There is an evening service tonight.
That's correct.
At 6:30.
Yes, thank you. Evening service tonight at 6:30. Austin.
Lift Men's Conference is coming up on March 1st. All the details are in the bulletin and on the flyer back here. But I just want to personally invite each man, a day of encouragement, refreshing in our walk as leaders.
Okay. If there's no others, move into our time of prayer requests or, testimonies, anything that you'd like to share with the congregation.
We can continue to remember Chris Byler. He is in, I think, the first week of Edge, and I think they go through a period they call Genesis, which is pretty extreme. And I heard something about being out in the trail, but I hear it's pretty secretive. They don't really say the details, but it requires a lot of vulnerability, and one of the biggest things they have to give up is all connection to family, and so they have to give up their phones. So I don't think John and Marion really know how Chris is doing right now, so you can pray for them, but especially pray for Chris as he's on this, kind of started this journey.